Examples of cultural relativistic thinking. To begin, we've been talking about this concept of cultural relativism, the idea that to truly understand cultures, we have to understand someone's ideas, we have to understand their practices from within in relationship to the whole of their culture. Yesterday, we began getting into the idea of how to think relativistically, principles that one can use to think through some aspect of cultural difference that one struggles to understand, that one can help one get within relationship perspective. Yesterday, we talked about how to think relativistically, principles to use to actually understand someone's ideas and practices from within and relationship to their culture. And so today I wanted to apply this to empirical examples, observational examples that have been established in anthropology to kind of illustrate this relativistic thinking in a different manner than the conceptual and the abstract. So to begin, we can think about a global cultural encounter in relationship to Brazilian culture, or concept of Brazilian culture. And so if we think about one cultural practice in Brazil that has been observed and which elicits often esocentric thinking, that is, somebody from American society or U.S. society might look at that cultural practice with an ethnocentric lens, see it as somehow inferior to their own culture and so on. They may talk about something like infanticide, right, in Brazilian culture. Infanticide defined as the killing, right, of infants. A practice like infanticide is easy to trigger, right, an ethnocentric kind of response, a response that is prejudiced, a response that is biased. And so as we've discussed, we would be first suspending our judgment. So I'm a parent, I love my child, I love children generally. And so, yes, at first, hearing something like infanticide in Brazilian culture, it's going to trigger my moral system. It's going to trigger my upbringing. It's going to trigger aspects of my own culture. And so those are all impediments here if I want to understand what's happening in another way of life that has been termed infanticide within my community. So suspending judgment, saying, okay, I want to understand what's going on here. I'm not going to rush to judgment. Yes, I have my own way of thinking about this, but I'm going to put that aside right now. Secondly, we talked about acknowledging fluidity and complexity. So in the context of infanticide, is this something that is new? Is it something that was in the past but is no longer practiced? Is it something that is practiced by every single Brazilian in Brazil? Right? I don't know these questions without doing the appropriate research, without really trying to understand, in a scientific way, what people in my society are referring to as infanticide. If we're going to acknowledge complexity, is this something that is also criticized within Brazilian culture? Are there debates? Are there discussions that are ongoing about this in Brazil that problematize generalizing it as Brazilian culture? These are all really important steps to thinking about a cultural practice or idea, right, from within a culture and in relationship to that culture. So the work of Nancy Shepherd Hughes, who sort of highlighted this issue in Brazil, really gives us a different understanding or idea about what's going on. For example, in poor areas of urban Brazil, and only in poor areas of urban Brazil, we do see that parents, if their young daughter, let's say, or young son is dying, they may give them less food each day. And so ethnocentrically, we may rush to judgment and just say infanticide. But this is an area of high poverty and an absence of adequate healthcare services. For those who practice this, it's a kind of death without weeping in their own worldview and own way of thinking about it. They know, because of their absence of resources and absence of healthcare, that the child will likely die anyway. Once a child is seen as weak or sickly, the young family will likely divert their scarce resources to her other children and thus indirectly, right, contribute to causing the infant's death. So in this sense, it's a survival strategy for poor shantytown women and families. It's not something that's done with the intention of simply killing children. It's a survival strategy when one doesn't have access to appropriate reproductive health services, one has multiple children but limited resources. To survive within that kind of context, it's only observed among poor shantytown women, poor slum dwellers, areas of dense poverty, and so on. So once you start to understand the context and dig into it, this isn't just Brazilian culture. It has a very specific context. Yes, people do debate and think about it critically. It is when families and individuals gain access to more resources, it isn't something that has continued to be practiced, something, let's say, inherent to them as particular kinds of human beings. And so understanding the context transforms, right, this completely from infanticide to death without weeping, from seeing something as inferior and being incredibly prejudiced by it to developing empathy and understanding, right, about why a particular group of people are equals in all ways, may develop a practice that at first, right, we may want to judge, we may want to criticize, and so on. Another example that we can think about is Somalian culture. So there are ideas and practices in Somalia, just like there are in Brazil or really any place in the world, in which you can consider an idea and practice and very quickly elicit, right, an ethnocentric perspective, that this idea or practice is inherently wrong, right, from our perspective. It represents something about the superiority of our culture here in the United States or in North America. And that would be something that people in our community might call female genital mutilation. So again, it's those steps of, well, I know in my upbringing and so on, being raised by a feminist-inspired woman who valued women's pleasure and sexuality, that it's very easy for me to immediately, when confronted by something like female genital mutilation, I don't need to understand anything about it, and immediately, right, I want to judge. Well, how could this possibly be a good practice? How could this be something that's not irrational? How could this be something that should be eradicated, and so on? But following those steps, right, we can think about suspending our judgment. Okay, this is in relationship to me. All this judgment, right, is all in relationship to the way I think about things. It's an obstacle to understanding what it may mean to Somalian women themselves. And so, again, suspending all of my own ideas about this, my own reactions and so on, just bracketing, putting them to the side for the time being. Acknowledge that fluidity and complexity. Is this something, again, from the past? Is this something that's not even practiced today? Is it practiced by all of society or only a portion of society? Are people within Somalia critical of this? Is there ongoing debates and so on? All really important, right, if we want to develop a relativistic view that is seeing this so-called female genital mutilation from within the culture itself. And so, like the first example, we move to trying to understand the context. And so anthropologists have done research and looked at this work, and you can think about the way rural areas in Somalia, when girls are quite young, it can be as young, let's say, as 7 years old, they will have their parents, have their family members create a special ritual, special event in their life in which they are circumcised. That if you think about it from a Somalian perspective, it is conceptualized in some ways similar to circumcision for men in Islamic culture, and which occurs roughly about the same time, although there's some variability from Islamic group to Islamic group. For these communities, female circumcision is considered essential for maintaining a girl's purity in the eyes of the community. It removes the incentives of individual pleasure in sexuality, and thus for the community provides a level of sanctity, cleanliness, purity for a girl, thus raising her status and raising her honor in the eyes of men and potentially her marriageable partners. Those who are uncircumcised would be viewed as unclean, unmarriageable, and potentially able to bring dishonor on families and communities. So in this sense, these women in rural Somalia would view female circumcision as a source of pride, as a rite of passage to adulthood for women. So if we begin to look at this within the specific context, right? Well, then it looks different to us, right? We can begin to see it from an insider's perspective. This doesn't mean that my own judgment, my own ideas, my own feelings, my own moral system is somehow rejected, let's say. No, I have suspended that to try to understand the practice from within their society, from within their worldview. And rather than simply mutilation as part of Somalian culture, let's say, well, I start to learn that, well, there are differences among Somalian women and communities. So there are progressive women, let's say in urban areas, that may not have this practice, but that in more conservative rural areas, it's actually a very important part of women's identity. Where in urban areas, there may be criticisms of this practice in Somalia itself. In rural areas, it's embraced as something meaningful and important to being a woman. So in this sense, right, that ability to understand the context does give us a different perspective on the idea and practice, and it allows us to see it from the perspective of a Somalian woman, let's say, a rural, conservative Somalian woman, which is the goal, right, of trying to think relativistically. That is a different perspective than if I had just allowed my kind of uncritical, ethnocentric lens on that practice. Now, right, I have a diversity of perspectives to view this from. I can lapse back into my ethnocentric practice and way of thinking, and I can shift over, right, to thinking about it relativistically. And that's a very powerful thing, to be able to think relativistically, to train oneself, right, to suspend one's judgment, to get a new view on an idea and practice. So for our final example, thinking about Indian culture. And so, like the first two examples, there are many ideas and practices, let's say from India, that may cause one to think ethnocentrically, to be ethnocentric, to look down upon Indian culture, to see our own culture in North America and the United States as somehow superior, and view their culture as bias. And so in our society, there are ideas and practices in India that we may refer to as suicide, as community-sanctioned suicide, as a legitimation of suicide in Indian culture. And so in an ethnocentric lens, right, with one's upbringing and one's way of life, one's legal structure and so on, right, it's illegal here to commit suicide. We often will try to prevent people from having a successful suicide. We believe that there are potentially mental health issues that could be resolved, and the person thus would not want to commit suicide. So we want to intervene and try to heal a person and prevent them, right, from committing suicide. So if we hear about a culture that celebrates suicide, then of course it's really easy to think, well, geez, how could they do that? What's wrong with those people? And so on. These kinds of really ethnocentric judgments. And so that's the first step, is to say, okay, I know what it's like in my own culture and my own way of life. I understand we don't necessarily celebrate suicide here, although I'll recognize there are suicide rights movements here in the United States and in Europe as well. So I recognize that even in my own society, people may see this differently. I bracket out what's happening about the thoughts and thinking around this practice in my own community. I put them aside because, again, they're just impediments to me to understand that Indians are viewing this. Do they even see it as suicide, let's say? People here calling this suicide really means nothing. Do these people know any of the languages of India? Have they ever talked to anybody about this particular practice? Do they really know what they're talking about, right? And so, yes, it's a really good move in thinking relativistically to understand culture by putting aside. That doesn't mean that I'm abandoning my moral system. If I feel deeply that suicide is wrong, doesn't mean that I'm doing that. It's simply a way of thinking about a practice from within that own culture, to suspend judgment. So I start thinking about fluidity and complexity here. Is this something sanctioned by all Indians? Do all Indians have a kind of homogeneous culture? Do they all think alike, and so on? Is this, again, a practice from the past? Is it a brand new kind of practice? Is it maintained only by a particular group of Indians, let's say, right? Trying to think through issues of fluidity and complexity for the cultural practice, rather than generalizing it, right? Well, Indians, legitimate suicide. Indians celebrate suicide. This kind of sloppy thinking, if you will. And then it's that digging into the context, right? Trying to understand the context with depth and richness and so on. So if we start looking into the anthropological research, right, around the context of the so-called suicide in Indian culture, we begin to acknowledge the richness and the depth, right, of the idea and practice, how different this really is from what people may in our own society simply call suicide. So no, it's not all Indians. It's not just simply Indian culture. India is a huge country, huge population, so many different ethnic groups and religious groups. And there is one religious group known as the Jain. It's actually a fairly small religious community in India today. So anthropologists observed how particular nuns, for example, so extremely devout Jains, not simply lay people, but let's say those who are living in monasteries, extremely pious, who may undergo spiritual kinds of transformations. When they undergo certain kinds of spiritual transformations, they may choose to pursue salakana, to free their spirit for the next life. And they may seek out their teachers in the monastery, the gurus in the monastery, who talk to them, right, about that spiritual transformation, about their desire for salakana. They may approve of a fast until death to become a sadhvi, to become a kind of holy. This is quite different than suicide because it's not a rejection of life. It's not something that's coming out of, let's say, depression, right? But it's a spiritual act of purifying oneself and achieving a state of liberation. So one is no longer tied to the physical body, its need for food and water. It's a spiritual detachment from worldly things, like the body, like its desires, its possessions, and so on. It's performed in a calm, rational state of mind without an intention to harm the self, which is quite a bit different than, let's say, the understanding of suicide that I have in my own community. For Jains, it's something to be practiced only by those who've reached the highest level of spiritual development. It's not impulsive, it's not done out of despair, and it's conducted under the guidance of monks and leaders, guru, and so on. So if one understands the context, let's say through the examples that I've been giving you today, looking at anthropological research that highlights the context of an idea or practice, well then it looks very different. Where we started with suicide and how could one practice that, to, wow, this is actually a very different idea and practice. It's very complex. It has different kinds of religious connotations. Clearly, there's more to know about this, right? This isn't what I thought of it at first. There's a lot more depth to this. It isn't just widely practiced by everyone. It's associated with one particular religion in India, and of that religion, it's of the highest level of its religious practitioners. Something fundamentally and qualitatively different, right, than our notions of suicide. So to conclude here, right, we've been trying to apply the steps of relativistic thinking, the general concept of relativistic thinking, to understand some cultural differences in our world, modeling like what we might encounter in a world of globalization, right, where people from different cultural backgrounds interact. We have modeled those steps: suspending judgment, acknowledging fluidity and complexity, and understanding the context. We've looked at some different cases from Brazil, Somalia, and India, and the various cultures within.